So there was a carbon that was brought called the it was called the carbon oila. In addition to shlamim, to the holiday peace offerings, they did bring oila. But the question is, what oila did they bring? So there are two opinions. It either was a carbon oila as we know it as a oilas re'iyah, or a carbon oila as we know it as a carbon tamid. In other words, we are familiar with these two oilas that are brought. One is the daily sacrifice, and the other one is the holiday sacrifice, both oilas. Oila means a burnt offering. So there were two burnt offerings. The burnt offering means that it was entirely burnt. All the other offerings, some of it was burnt, but it wasn't entirely burnt. And the oila was entirely burnt. And so it says when they went, before they got to Torah, they were there at the mountain. They had camped. Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar. They camped by the mountain. So on the 5th day of Sivan, which was right before, a day or two before they got to Torah, they brought sacrifices. It says that the Bechayrim brought sacrifices, and they brought oila and shalmei and shlamim. Oila and shlamim. That means a burnt offering and a peace offering. And the Gemara here is debating what type of oila was it. So if you learn that it was the daily burnt offering, what comes out is that the peace offering for holidays actually has a precedent where it was once brought, where you didn't bring an oila, you didn't bring the burnt offering, but you brought that offering, which means it has some type of superiority to it. On the other hand, if you learn that it was the burnt offering of holidays, it comes out that you have both sacrifices were brought together at that time. And according to that, there's no real superiority of one over the other because they were both brought koidem hadibor, before the revelation at Sinai. So if you say that one of them was that the burnt offering was the daily offering, it wasn't the holiday offering, then we have a precedent of a holiday peace offering without a holiday burnt offering, which means the holiday peace offering has some type of a superiority. But if you say that they were both holiday offerings, then you don't really have a source of a superiority of the peace offering over the burnt offering. So this is basically the discussion of our Gemara. So now we've turned the page, and we got involved in how God gave the Torah. Did God transmit all the details at Sinai, or were they later transmitted to Moses? And this is a debate between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. Now, the Gemara has an interesting logic here. It says that if you hold that the sacrifice was a daily sacrifice that they brought the daily sacrifice there at Mount Sinai, what will end up happening, at least according to Rabbi Yishmael, is that the daily sacrifice changed in the way it was brought. It was brought there at Mount Sinai in a way that was not fully kosher. They didn't do the cutting up of the pieces properly. They didn't skin it. It wasn't necessarily skinned. And so the laws of those two laws, according to Rabbi Yishmael, were not given them. They were only given later. And if so, it would be surprising that Rabbi Yishmael would hold that the Karban Tamid changed in the way it was. It changed from one way to the other. It started out as a simple sacrifice, and then it changed to become a sacrifice where you have all these details. So it seems surprising. The Gemara seems surprised about that it would start out one way and then it would change afterwards. Now, if you hold that it was a burnt offering, not a daily sacrifice, but a burnt offering for the holidays, then it doesn't, the Gemara is not surprised that you wouldn't have the details that the way it was supposed to be brought later and the way it's brought now, because the Gemara sees it as more of a voluntary offering, and later it would be an obligatory offering. So if it's a holiday offering, it's not surprising. Now, Teves says something interesting here. Teves says it's not because of voluntary versus obligatory. The top Teves seems to say that because it doesn't say the laws of how it's supposed to be skinned and cut in pieces, there were certain laws how you had to cut it up. So because it doesn't say that clearly regarding the law of the holiday burnt offering, that's not a problem that it would have changed. But the law of the burnt offering, the daily burnt offering, that it says it more explicitly. And there would be surprising that the laws would have changed from before the giving of the Torah and after the giving of the Torah. That would be surprising. So that's Teves' a point here. But the other way of understanding it was that it had to do with being a voluntary sacrifice. Rashi seems to say this point, that it was voluntary. Ume'elehem hikrivuha. Rashi is about 15 lines from the top, and it's the Rashi of Mi Ika Midi. He says it must be an oilas re'iyah, which means the holiday burnt offering. Vadei oilas re'iyah havi ume'elehem hikrivuha. They brought it on their own. So if you say it was a obligatory sacrifice, that's what the Gemara seems surprised that it would have changed. Which means that there are laws that seem to have changed from before the giving of the Torah and after the giving of the Torah, but the obligations before and after didn't change. At least that's what it seems like from Rashi, that would be surprising. Now, the Gemara is going to retract from this idea in a little bit, but in the meantime, the Gemara wants to prove from this back and forth, or this type of I would say, process of elimination, of proving Rabbi Yishmael's view. At this point, the Gemara seems to prove it through this process of elimination and saying that, well, Rabbi Yishmael must hold that the sacrifice was a holiday. It was a holiday sacrifice, because holiday burnt offering, because if it would be the daily burnt offering, it would be a problem that it changed from one to the other. Okay, that was the Gemara's proof based on this process of elimination. Now, Rabbi Eliezer, or as the Gemara says it, Rabbi Elazar, it mentions this other point, and that is that it says Oilas Tamid Hoasuya Bahar Sinai, that Rabbi Eliezer says that when it says it was made on Har Sinai, it means that its actions, its procedures, its rules were stated, were told to Moshe at Har Sinai, but the Atzma Loi Karva, it itself was not brought then, which means that he also holds that it was an oilas re'iyah, was a holiday sacrifice. So again, what we've done is we've basically found other views that follow this way of thinking. So what we're really doing here is interpreting a verse that talks about the story in Parshas Mishpatim, the story of the revelation at Sinai and what happened beforehand. And keep in mind, this is the same story as Parshas Yisro, but the Torah repeats it because it adds more details and it mentions more things. For example, it also mentions about the Naaseh v'Nishman, the end of portion of Mishpatim, it sort of like goes back and goes over some of the details at what happened at Mount Sinai. So this is we're really trying to explain the verse there that talks about the sacrifices, and based on that, we're understanding why the rabbis would have either given precedence to the peace offering and some type of superiority of to the peace offering, or maybe not. So that's what it all boils down to. Now, the Gemara then mentions Rabbi Akiva's view, and Rabbi Akiva holds that once they brought it at Mount Sinai, they never stopped. They always brought this sacrifice throughout their time in the desert. So even though the verse says that there's a verse in Amos that implies they didn't, but that verse is the Gemara says the Gemara says that the verse is like a rhetorical question, and it says, did the sacrifices, did you bring the sacrifices in the desert for the 40 years? Like, you did that, which means that they didn't do that. And according to Rabbi Akiva, he says once they brought this daily sacrifice, they never stopped. The Gemara answers that it was Shevet Levi that didn't worship idols. They were the ones who brought it. And they brought it, and Rashi adds the word Mishelahem. It was their own money. They paid for it with their own money. And the rest of the Jewish people were not really part of it. So they were rebuked because they were not part of it, which had to do with the fact that they were excommunicated because of the sin of the golden calf, and they weren't supposed to bring a sacrifice. I should mention that there is a discussion here among the commentaries about the fact that someone who is excommunicated is allowed to send someone else to bring their sacrifice. So our Gemara implies that the Jewish people were not involved at all in bringing sacrifices in the desert. At least Rabbi Akiva is saying this. They didn't bring it. It was brought by the Leviim, but the regular Israelites didn't bring it. The Leviim brought it. But the question is that it would seem that they could have also arranged that. They could have sent someone to bring it. Why do we assume that they didn't bring this sacrifice in the desert when they theoretically they could have? So this is a Gemara in Ma'at Katan, and it mentions over there that in the desert they did send their sacrifices to the Mizbeach. So one way of answering this question is that there's a difference between obligatory sacrifices and communal sacrifices, and maybe they only sent voluntary sacrifices. They were in the desert, and they didn't get involved in bringing the communal sacrifice. So there is such an answer. There's also another interesting point, that the way of answering this question, and that has to do with the fact that there is a debate in the Gemara Chulin. The Gemara over there mentions, were they allowed to eat meat in the desert if it was not a sacrifice? So Rabbi Yishmael over there says that the Jews were not allowed to eat meat in the desert unless it was brought as a sacrifice. And according to that, we understand that they must have brought sacrifices. And that would be Rabbi Yishmael's view. And the Gemara here is following the view of Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that they were allowed to eat meat, even if it was not a carbon. And according to him, they didn't bring any sacrifices in the desert, and they were able to eat meat because you don't need to bring, you can eat meat even if it's not a meat of a sacrifice. So basically, the way to reconcile this contradiction is that the Gemara in Moed Katan is following Rabbi Yishmael, and according to that, the Jews obviously brought karbanis because they ate meat. Even though it wasn't a meat of a carbon, and Rabbi Akiva holds that they didn't bring sacrifices, and they were allowed to slaughter their own meat. So that's another way of reconciling this seeming contradiction about did they bring sacrifices in the desert. It would end up being an argument between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva if they actually brought sacrifices in the desert. And again, according to Rabbi Akiva, the Levium did. The Levium brought sacrifices, but it would only mean that the Israelites did not bring sacrifices in the desert. Now, the Gemara continues and talks about Beis Hillel and the opinions that follow Beis Hillel. So let's start there. We are going to start about 12 or 15 lines from the top of the page. 15 lines from the top of the page on page 6b. We're on page 6b, and we're starting with the words Beis Hillel Hada Amar. Beis Hillel are, we have already mentioned their view that according to Beis Hillel, they did not bring the burnt offering for holidays in the desert. Rather, what did they bring? They brought the daily sacrifice. That's the view of Beis Hillel. And again, what do we care about all this? What is it? What is the purpose of this discussion? It's all to prove if the peace offering is more superior to the burnt offering, at least financially. Would there be any superiority to the burnt offering to the peace offering over the burnt offering? So again, we have Beis Hillel, and that's Hada Amar, and we already mentioned their view of how they hold that it was a daily burnt offering instead of a holiday burnt offering in the desert. Rabbi Akiva, Hanami da Amaran, Rabbi Akiva, we also mentioned his view, we just mentioned it, that Rabbi Akiva says the Levium brought sacrifices in the desert, and that's what it's referring to, that the daily offering was brought through the Levium, but it was brought daily throughout the time in the desert, every single day from the 5th day of Sivan and onward. Interestingly, that's how Rabbi Akiva learns, which means that they came to Mount Sinai and they started bringing that daily sacrifice from that day and onward. Now, the last view was Rabbi Yossi Haglili. So that's what the Gemara says. Rabbi Yossi Haglili, the Tanya, so Rabbi Yossi Haglili, we actually have a brisa that tells us how he learned, because he says, Shalish mitzvahs and Savi Yishal ba'aloisam l'regel. There are 3 commandments when they go to be oila regel, and the Gemara continues and says, Re'iyah v'chagiga v'simcha. It was these three mitzvahs, and Re'iyah, which is this burnt offering, Chagiga, the peace offering, and the Simcha is the joy, the mitzvah of joy. These three mitzvahs, they were commanded. Now, Rashi mentions the Simcha is referring to Shalmei Simcha. They are the peace offerings of joy. If a person doesn't have either donations, peace offering of donations that he donated all year round, which he would normally bring on the holidays, because if you're anyway going to Israel, to Jerusalem, you would bring, if you're anyway going to Jerusalem, you'd bring all of your commitments, your donations, you would bring them then, your pledges, you bring them then. And also, you would probably bring your Meiser Behema, your tithings. Every time you have 10 babies of animal babies born, so you would give one out of every 10 as a korban called the korban Meiser Behema. Now, if you don't have any of those, then you would bring a korban called the Shalmei Simcha. And that korban would either be from your own money or from Meiser Sheni, that you should have meat for up to your satisfaction. And because the real joy on a holiday is meat. So the mitzvah of Simcha would apply to either your extra sacrifice that you're going to bring, or a different sacrifice that you're anyway bringing, but you're bringing on the holiday. As long as you're going to have meat for the holiday, you're all set. You're fulfilling the mitzvah of Simcha. That mitzvah of Simcha is one of the three mitzvahs. So again, the Simcha could be fulfilled with alternative methods. It doesn't have to be the meat of a new sacrifice that you never planned on bringing, and now that you're there, you bring it. No, could be from a previous sacrifice that you're bringing and that you pledged, and now you're finally bringing it. That would also be considered your fulfillment of the mitzvah of Simcha. Now, the Gemara mentions that yesh b're'iyah shemesh te'em. There are elements of re'iyah, that there is something unique about Re'iyah that you don't have in the other two. The Re'iyah is the burnt offering for the holiday. Re'iyah literally means seeing. And it means God sees you, you see God, so to speak, or you're seen by God. And so it's that's the term Re'iyah. So there's something unique in the Re'iyah mitzvah that you don't have in the other two mitzvahs. V'yesh b'chagiga. And there is something unique about the Chagiga, the peace offering, Shem B'Shteyim, that you don't have in the other two, the burnt offering, Re'iyah, and the peace offering called Simcha. You don't have in those two, but you have in Chagiga. Now, Yesh b'Simcha Shem B'Shteyim, there's also something unique about Simcha that you don't have in the other two. So what is this? What is this? What are the differences? What are these unique elements that each of these mitzvahs have? Yesh b'Re'iyah Shem B'Shteyim She'Re'iyah Oila Kula L'Gavaya. The Re'iyah is totally burnt for Hashem. Mashek and B'Shteyim, you don't have that in the other two. The other two are peace offerings. Only part of it is burnt for Hashem. Yesh b'Chagiga Shem B'Shteyim. There's something unique about the Chagiga that you don't have in the other two. Shachagiga Yesh L'Fnei Adibur. That we said the Chagiga was even before Hashem gave that mitzvah at Har Sinai. Even before Hashem gave the mitzvah, there was a korban Chagiga. And interestingly enough, he says this term, that's what's unique about the Chagiga. Now, what does that tell us about the oila that was brought then? If he's telling us that what's unique about the Chagiga is that it was brought before Har Sinai, what does that say about the oila that was brought then? That it couldn't have been an oilas re'iyah, according to him. Because if it was an oilas re'iyah, then Chagiga is not unique. There was also an oilas re'iyah, there was also a burnt offering. So if he's telling us that a Chagiga was there, that's what's unique about the Chagiga, that the peace offering of the holidays was brought before the Torah was given, and that's what's unique about it. It means that there wasn't a different offering brought before the Torah was given. There wasn't another holiday offering brought. It was only the Chagiga holiday offering. So he must hold that the other offering that was brought was not a holiday offering, because he's saying the Chagiga is unique. The peace offering is unique. It means that there was no burnt offering for holidays. That the other two were not there. And then he says, there's something unique about Simcha. There's Simcha that it's Nayheg in men, for men, women. The other two are not obligatory on both men and women. And Rashi tells us over here, it's applicable by women. You should rejoice, you and your household. Basically means not only you, but your wife as well. The other two sacrifices, women are not obligated. They're time-bound positive commandments. They're exempt from those. But the simcha is an obligation because it says ato uveisecha. Now, so here we have the final view of Rabbi Yossi Haglili that obviously holds that the oila that was brought, the burnt offering that was brought at Mount Sinai, was not the holiday burnt offering. It was a daily burnt offering. Now, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yishmael, my time of kamoik maslak beishama. Abaye wanted to claim that he organized the names of all the people, the opinions. And what did he say? Abaye said on 6a, he says, these three rabbis follow this view, and these three rabbis follow that. So the Gemara asks, Rabbi Yishmael, why are you, Abaye, why are you saying Rabbi Yishmael holds like Beis Shammai? My time of why are you saying that he holds like Beis Shammai? Maybe he holds like Beis Hillel. Why? Because what's the reason you hold like Beis Shammai? If you're going to think, if you're going to say that the burnt offering that the Yidden brought in the desert was an oilas tamid havi, that it was a daily obligatory offering, is it possible that it changed? The law changed. It's basically the law of the burnt offering law that has laws about the skinning and the cutting up of the pieces of the animal, and before it's burnt, it had to be cut in certain parts were cut and detached. And so is it possible that before Sinai you did it one way, and after Sinai you did it a different way? It doesn't seem logical. And this is only a problem according to Rabbi Yishmael, who learns the Torah, who learns that we didn't have all the details of the laws before Har Sinai, which would mean that it was brought one way before Har Sinai, it was brought another way after Har Sinai. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi Haglili, the Amar Oila Shekrivi Yisrael Bamidbar Eilas Tamid Havi. Rabbi Yossi Haglili says it was a burnt offering, the daily burnt offering, and Meikara Loibai Hefshev Nituach Vilabsaif Bai Hefshev Nituach. And he holds that initially it didn't need to be cut and skinned this way. And in the end, after Mount Sinai, it did need to be cut and skinned this certain way. And it changed. The law changed. The tiny, because we have a brisa. Rabbi Yossi Haglili says, the burnt offering that they brought In the desert, which we know was a daily Talmud sacrifice, it was the daily offering. It didn't need to be skinned and cut in that certain way. Because the only skinning and cutting of it was needed to be done from after Har Sinai, what we call from the tent of meeting, where God would speak to Moses and gave him those details of the laws. And that's when he got the law about how it had to be skinned and cut to pieces. And that's when the law changed of the daily burnt offering, that it initially did not need to be cut and skinned in a certain way. And after Har Sinai, in the desert, the law changed, and they actually got the new details, the other details of the law, and they started doing it differently. So we see that Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds that. So it's not totally surprising that you would have such a view that a law would change from one way to the other way. That the law could be that it initially was without hefshet and ituach, initially didn't need to have this skinning and this cutting in a certain way. And then afterwards, it had that law that it would need to be done in that way. So the Gemara answers, you're right. And you know what? We'll have to remove Rabbi Yishmael. We don't really know for sure Rabbi Yishmael's view. We were using the process of elimination and trying to prove what his view was, but we just found that our proof was not solid, was not absolute. And we see there's another view that goes against our logic. Rabbi Yossi Aglili seems to go against the logic that we use. And so therefore, it could be that Rabbi Yishmael also follows in that same line of reasoning. And therefore, the Gemara says, Sami Mikan Rabbi Yishmael. Let's erase from here Rabbi Yishmael that was stated, his name was stated on the list of those that hold that the oila, the burnt offering that was brought in the desert must have been a holiday burnt offering. We erase his name from that list because it's possible that he holds it was the daily burnt offering, not the holiday burnt. Okay. And that's the end sort of this little piece. And now the Gemara says, Boy Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda asked, he asked the question. Hi kra hechiksiv. How do you read? How is it written? This pasuk, the following pasuk, the following verse. And what he really means is, how is it? What is the meaning of it? He uses the word haikra hechiksiv. How is it written? But what he means is, like, how is it? How is the punctuation of it? Like the grammar? Because the verse says, "Vayishlach nare b'nei Yisrael." He sent the youth of the Jewish people, which we said meant the b'chayrim, the firstborns. Vayalu oilais, and they brought oilais. And the verse continues and says, and I'm just going to skip a word. I want to tell you the verse. They brought oilais, vayizbechu zvachim shlamim lashem parim. And they brought zvachim shlamim. They brought peace offerings to Hashem. And then it says parim, bulls. So there are two ways of reading it. One way of reading it is that you read the entire verse all the way till the end, that you don't put a comma really. they brought oilos and shlamim, burnt offerings and peace offerings, bulls. They used bulls for both. Another way of reading it is they brought burnt offerings, comma, and they brought peace offerings of bulls. So the question is, did the bulls, does that go back on the burnt offerings also? Or does the bulls only apply to the peace offering? Because it says bulls at the end, right next to peace offering, but it could be that it's going back on both the burnt offerings and the peace offerings. On the other hand, we know the burnt offerings are generally, at least the daily offering, as a keves echad tasev habayker. You bring the keves, the sheep, the lamb in the morning, and you bring the lamb in the afternoon. So generally the sacrifice that was brought as the daily offering, which was an oila, which was a burnt offering, that was a keves. So here is Rav Chizda's question. Now I'm going to read it inside. Hey, haikra hechiksiv. This pasuk, how is it written? How is it written? Vayishlach esnari b'nei Yisrael vayalu oilos. It's they brought up he sent the youth of the Bnei Yisrael, which means the firstborns of the Bnei Yisrael, and they brought oilos, burnt offerings, kvasim, in parentheses. Kvasim meaning that this means that they brought those offerings, which happened to be lambs. It doesn't say the word kvasim in the verse, but it means kvasim. They brought a burnt offering, and we assume that the burnt offering was kvasim. And then it continues in the verse. And they brought sacrifices of peace to Hashem. And the verse ends off with the word parim, bulls. So that would mean that you put a comma in the middle, and you basically have two parts of the verse. The first part is just mentioning that they brought the burnt offerings, which we can assume meant a lamb, and the end of the verse clarifies what type of peace offerings that they bring, and the peace offering was a bull. Now, the other way of reading it, oy dilma, or maybe idi v'idi paramhav, maybe both are bulls. Maybe they brought bulls for both because that's the way you read it. It doesn't say lambs, and maybe you're not supposed to put a comma over there, and therefore you would read it straight. They brought burnt offerings and peace offerings of bulls. So that's the Gemara's question. The Gemara says, "Lamai nafkamina." I mean, this is not a sacrifice that we have to bring in the future. This was a story that happened, and maybe it's unclear. Okay, we don't know exactly what they brought, but what happened, happened. It's not really applicable so much to us. It's not like a mitzvah that's going to apply. Mitzvah, we need to know what it means. This is something that happened. So is there a difference? Is there something important about it that makes a difference? Why, it doesn't have much practical applicability in today's day. I mean, so the Gemara answers, Marzutra Amar. Marzutra says, Lepisuk ta'amim. You know what the difference is? How to recite it when you read the Torah with the notes. Because the notes are sort of the Torah's way of grammar. That's what the notes are. So when you hear the Chaz of the Balkaire end the verse, that's the end of the sentence. When you hear him do what's called an asnachta, which is like in the middle of the sentence, where it's like a stop, that's like a comma. So you have punctuation, you have the grammar based on the notes. So he says there's two ways of reading it. You could read it without a asnachta, without this comma in the middle, and so as Rashi says that if you want to say it's two separate species, you would have to put a asnachta, which is like a comma, in the middle. And so when the Balkaire, the person who reads the Torah, when he reads it, he knows to sort of like make a little, sort of like a little stop, a semi-stop over there, and like a comma, and then continue. Now, if it's all one, meaning there was all the bulls were for both, then you wouldn't stop. It would be like a pashto or revia. It would basically just continue. And so that's the answer that Mar Zutra gives. Rav Acha Brei de Rava says, Rav Acha comes up with an answer that's sort of like, you could use this answer for any question ever. If anyone ever asks you, what's the difference? Here you have an answer to that question. Rav Acha Brei de Rava Amar, La'omer, if the person says, Harei alai oila, ka'oila she'ekriva Yisrael b'midbar. I am going to bring an oila, the same one that they brought in the desert. So what is he committing himself to? So he's saying a promise based on that sacrifice. So basically, what that means is that he's pledging himself to bring a sacrifice similar to the one that was brought in the desert, and therefore you need to know which one it was. You could use this a lot. If anyone ever asks you, so what's the difference? You say, if I pledge to bring that, to use that as a, whatever you did, I'm going to use that. I'll have to bring a sacrifice if you did it this way or something like that. So he's basically saying, I'm going to bring a sacrifice the way the ones that they did in the desert. That would be a difference of if did they use lambs or did they use bulls? And the Gemara's answer is Teiku. Teiku means we don't know. We don't know how to read it, and we don't know what the if it's supposed to be. We don't know which sacrifices they actually use.